Okay, let me introduce or set the stage here for what we're going to be doing. We have John Winfield Walker.
Winfred. I should have told Winfred.
I'm sorry, I might make another mistake or two.
Okay.
You might want to start over.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Okay.
Why? He is one of the most highly respected civil rights lawyers in Arkansas history. And so we're proud to be here today to have an opportunity to document what he has to say about his history in the law and the development of these issues in the state of Arkansas and elsewhere. I'm David Hargis. I come out of South Arkansas, and I've been here in Little Rock since about the early 1970s. I came to know John Walker first as a friend, and then we've worked together in a number of cases up to this point. The last time I represented him, he was at the Pulaski County Jail teaching the police officers about the new laws about taking photographs at traffic scenes. Wasn't that the way that happened? He had about 8 lawyers coming out to represent him. I'm here today also with another friend, David Hodges, who's a longtime practitioner of the law. He comes out of northeast Arkansas in Newport, and he was a prosecuting attorney there. He's just practically the same age as John Walker. Actually, I've tried cases against him and worked with him before, and I think he's the toughest lawyer there is in the state of Arkansas, but that has nothing to do with this deposition today. David Hodges has 3 sons, and his middle son is Craig Hodges, who is sitting here with us today, and I think you wanted to have some comments about that, did you not?
Well, Craig is now working on documentaries, and we wanted him to sit in and be involved in this as a potential documentary, although we want to make clear that the copyright for all of this is in John Walker and not us as individuals, even though we're going to be involved in asking questions. And then Craig has a friend. You want to introduce him, Craig?
Yeah, this is John Crawford.
And John Crawford's here is also a documentary individual or works in documentaries. So that's the people that are here.
All right. John, you were born in 1937, June the 3rd, 1937 in Hope, Arkansas. Is that correct?
Yep.
You attended a school there called Yeager
Yerger. Y-E-R-G-E-R.
High School until 1952. From the time that you start remembering about things until you left there when you were 14 years old, can you just tell us what your experience was growing up, spending that early part of your life in Hope, Arkansas?
Well, I take it you're talking about my educational experiences, or any of them. I
want to know also about the interracial involvement that existed at that time in our state and a large part of our country.
Well, I'll do the best I can, and I became conscious of race during the end of the war, World War II, when I was 1941. It was Pearl Harbor. And I remember people, white and black, running the streets and trying to saying things to rush to safety because the Japs are coming. The Japs are coming. Well, I didn't know to whom they were referring. And at that time, there was a fear that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and they were coming into the mainland of the United States, and they were going to take over and destroy all the people in the United States. And these were older persons, mostly white, and I guess black people got caught up in the euphoria. We all were saying the same thing. They were all saying the same thing. We were coming out of the Depression in part because there was a war. And I grew up as a Depression baby. So many of my nearby friends between 4 and the age of 10 or 11 were poor white kids. I guess I didn't know whether they were poor or not. I stayed with my grandmother a lot, who lived near town, or in town, and a block, in 2 blocks away lived Buddy Sutton, who was, as I later came to learn, a very eminent football player, who was one of the so-called touchdown twins, but he was older, and we played across from each other on vacant lots, sunlot football and baseball and other things. And we didn't think too much about race because we went our separate way and they went theirs.
When you say you went your separate way, what does that mean?
I mean, black kids went one way and white kids went the other. We went to a school that had portables, and they had a big, nice big building, and we had their books. I didn't know why we had used books, and later on I learned that our books came from Hope Elementary and Hope High School, and they'd been written on or torn through. I didn't think much about it because we had a group of teachers who kept us sort of focused on what they were teaching, and they gave us much work to do. We were able to. I wasn't very physical, so most of my interaction came when the bigger boys needed somebody to make out a team. Otherwise, if I interacted with them, I was the scorekeeper or the ball boy. And later on, when it became evident that I wasn't going to be chosen for teams, I interacted with the girls. And so we'd sit down and play Ring Around the Roses, do all those things, and then we'd get our lesson. So I learned a lot more from exclusion within the race, and also more because I'm dealing with the students who are more serious about studying. And I didn't think much about race, even though it was apparent. We lived on the corner, and across the street there were white people, and in the next block there were white people in town, and there were some well-to-do areas which were all white.
What did your parents do?
My dad was a laborer who worked at Myers Bakery to my last recollection, and my mother was a domestic when she worked, but she didn't always have a lot of work. And we lived in a what we call shotgun house. You ever heard of shotgun?
Yes. Why does it have that name?
Well, it's a house that's a rectangle, and if you shoot through the house, it goes through everything in the house. Boom. We had 3 rooms, and
How many children?
There were 6 people living in the house, mother and father and 4 children.
In 3 rooms?
In 3 rooms. We were in one room, which was a bedroom. They 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. And then they were in a room which sort of doubled as a living room. And then we had a kitchen, and a bathroom was about 100 feet in the back from the house. And our faucet was, our running water was outside, about 30 feet from the house. And in order to have warm water to bathe with, we had to heat the water on the stove, a little tin stove. And because I was the oldest kid, when it came turn for the kids to bathe, I had the first turn. They used to call it first water. And then the younger kids would take second and third water. We didn't pour that water out. We used the same water. I never really thought too much about it other than somehow or another the other kids didn't want to come behind me. But I never really thought about it because I had the first water, being the oldest child in the house. But that's the way we lived. But
What about Commerce and Hope at the time?
At that time, my grandmother lived 1 block from McLaughly Ford Old man McClarty was just getting started with a Ford dealership. And as I recall it, there was a brick making company, and there was a bread making company, and a candy factory, and a sawmill, and several things that they called plants from which smoke came, but they were distant, so I never got to go to them, didn't know what they did.
In my hometown of Warren, which is similar to Hope, there were separate areas of commerce such as funeral parlors and barbershops and other types of commerce that were completely segregated. And
Well, that's interesting because
maybe Hope was different.
I can't say that Hope was different, but I know that there was a black grocery store and a black hotel and a black restaurant next to the grocery store. And across the street there was a black physician whose father had been a physician. And they were all in the same block. Now, they had a grocery store, they had a hotel there and a restaurant in part because the people who worked on the railroad stopped in Hope. And they provided for the people who were laborers working on the train tracks. They provided lodging to those people and anybody else who came to town, so that the hotel was on top of the restaurant, and the grocery store was right next to it. Now there was a funeral home, same funeral home is there now, that was there then, and their kids were the ones who got Christmas presents, the new toys at Christmas time rather than used or no toys. And we got peppermint candy and a few little things, like things you could blow bubbles with and the like. But that was the way it was. There were no major employers of black people except as laborers. And the one doctor that we had moved to Camden some years later. The black business section was right next to the white business section. And from where we lived, McLarty Ford was right before the black business section. And then after the black business section, there were other areas of commerce and city government. I recall when I was about 12 or 13, I went with my grandfather to a drugstore downtown. My grandfather was a school principal. And there was this little boy behind the counter that I'd been playing with. We played for years together. And I recall when my grandfather finished his purchases and he went through the line to pay for it, the little boy said, "Well, JW, how you doing today?" They called him JW. At that time, my grandpa was like 60 years old, 55 to 60 years old. And I said, "You can't call him JW. You're supposed to call him Mr. Walker." And Grandpa said, "Hush, hush." I said, "Well, he's not supposed to disrespect you like that. Hush, hush." And he walked me out of there. And he never told me why he did that. I was left to try to figure it out. But I came to conclude that the line of the cessation of social interaction was when we became teenagers. And at that time, black people became boys if they were older, and the boys became the men. And the black men had to refer to the white boys by courtesy titles like Mr., or the girls by Miss. And I didn't understand why the white people were always Mr. somebody's first name or Miss somebody's first name. And we were always either JW or boy.
Okay, you left there when you were 14.
I left right after I turned 14. I turned 15 in the summer of...
But I don't want to leave that without asking you.
I left there in the summer of 1952. It was because I was going into my 11th grade. It was because my father had been out of work for a number of years, and he'd had some other problems. And my mother didn't really have a job, and we depended on my grandparents to an extent for survival. We had a cousin who took great pride in talking about his educated auntie and uncle who were in Arkansas, and how he was doing. He and his father, my grandfather's brother, were doing well in Texas. So he brought his truck down and packed up some of our stuff and took me and my dad back to Houston.
Other than the incident that you talked about, did you ever see or know of any interracial violence that occurred?
Yes.
Okay.
There was a fellow named Herman Maxwell in about 1948 who had been convicted of either rape or of rape, I think it was. And his body was at Hicks Funeral Home. And we were, as kids, told to go and see this body. And we saw Mr. Maxwell's body in the casket. He was an ordinary black man whose head had been shaved. And we were told that that's what you get when you mess around with white women. Apparently, and the black side of the story was that he had been caught at the house of a white woman and they were having intercourse. And the husband came home and she started yelling, "Rape, rape." And he picked up his clothes and ran out the back door. And they caught him and charged him and convicted him. And that was to show that what happens to black people who cross the line. My town was notorious for a number of lynchings. And my grandparents tried to keep it from me as far as I could tell. But I learned that right next to the water company, there had been a black man who was also accused of lynching in the 30s. His name was Brownie Tuggle. And his widow was a cafeteria worker at Yerga Elementary School. And during that time, all the black people were required to come downtown to watch as they lynched this man by dragging him through the streets and then hanging him from the telephone pole in front of the Hope Water Company. It was a conspicuous place next to the railroad track there. Now, I never saw that, but I knew every time I saw Mrs. Tuggle, I empathized with her and, of course, didn't say anything and just felt that she had to be a strong person to be able to just stay in that town and to persevere. There had been another person lynched who was on the railroad, working on the railroad, according to legend. And he was the father of a prominent black lady in Little Rock who's still living, who was married to a physician. And because he was a foreman of a crew and stood up for his crew and the like, after he left Hope, I'm told that somewhere between Hope and Prescott, he was pulled off the train and lynched. Now, those are experiences that I recall in Hope. I also recall that we didn't have facilities. We didn't have a gym. We didn't have a basketball court. And we had a football field that had no bleachers. It was just a plain field. But we had finally a football team. And in order for us to have our football players play football, Thursday night at the White Stadium was reserved for black folk. Any other time, all other times were for the whites. And I recall that we got to come from Hope to the State Fair on what they used to call Colored Day. I was 7, 8, 9. We always looked forward to coming to the State Fair. Well, you know, children sort of learn what they live. And we came. It was a big event. And it didn't bother, I didn't know that it was Colored Day. All I knew is that there were a lot of black kids at the state fairgrounds here on one day of the week while the state fair was here. And we also got to go to the experiment station at the University of Arkansas place there, 3 miles out of Hope, on what they call Colored Day. Now later on I understood that colored, C-U-L-L-U-D, Colored Day was like a fixture to maintain, it undergirded the racial divide, because whatever whites were doing, we were doing too. But we were doing it separately and at specified times. I came to learn about that later on as I began to read. And when I was in school at Hope, I learned about all the black poets and poetesses, and about black history and the struggle, and didn't really put it into context. I learned about how people were paid and how opportunity was spread around. And I came to think that, and this is pertinent for going to Houston, I came to think that the way people lived and the extension of opportunity was the way things were supposed to be. I used to think that, well, white people needed more money than black people to live. And that the houses should be bigger, and they should be better, and they should have bigger cars. And that what we were doing was fine. And I knew about the feeling that I had about segregation, but I thought that that's the way life had ordained it.
I think you've done a pretty good job of explaining what your posture was back till you were around 14.
Well, when I
That's
got
when
to
you
Houston,
moved to Houston.
Well, when I moved to Houston,
Unless you've got something more to say about it.
no, not a whole.
I think you've given a really good picture of what it was like.
All right.
Why did you go to Houston? Now,
Well,
your father
I
needed
went to
work.
Houston because of poverty, and we really didn't have enough resources to survive. So my mother and 3 children were left for 3 months, and I went to work with my cousin, who was a contractor. I guess he was a contractor. He worked on houses for white people, and he collected rent for Jewish people. And his father was the manager of the yard crew at South Texas Lumber Company. So he was able to afford my father a regular job. And I was able to make $10 to $20 a week working with my cousin, and I stayed at his house. And then the rest of my family came right before school started. So during that time, I learned a little bit more about race. I didn't know what a Jew was until I got to Houston, and I heard my cousin talking about how he worked for these Jews, and these Jews smart people. They knew how to make money. And I guess my experience with Jews was biblical, and it came as a result of my recollection of Jesus Christ being a Jew. All right, and but the way he said it was that he was working for these good people, Mr. So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so, and he collected their rent. And they had all these row houses in Houston, all over the place. And he collected rent from 1 or 2 people, from about 40 people, and he got to keep a little bit of it. And he worked on those houses, and he kept them in good repair. So that meant he always had work to do. And because he was making decent money and was independent somewhat, he sort of berated my grandfather and grandmother, who had graduated from Wiley College in 1912. His brother never went to college, and he dropped out. But when I got to Houston, he befriended me. We became, fast friends, even though he was much older. And I learned a lot from him. And enrolled in school in Houston.
And what did you do? How were your academics?
Well, when I got to Houston, I lived in the same kind of house that I did in Hope. But this time I was upgraded. I lived on a railroad track. And so when I got there, it was a shotgun house. But this time, instead of the bathroom being 100 feet away, it was right outside the back of the house. It was 3 rooms too. And we had a little pool, you remember that? Commode. So I was ashamed. I was ashamed to have my friends at school come to my house. So what I would do is I'd walk 30 blocks to school, which was called Jack Yates High School in Houston, Texas.
Did you say 30 blocks?
30.
How long would that be?
That's roughly 2.5 to 3 miles. And the school was in the middle of a poverty area and a more well-to-do area. So, and it was the premier school. I didn't know it at the time, for black kids there and in the state of Texas. And the other school in that town was called Phyllis Wheatley, and I was unaware at the time, but over in that school was Barbara Jordan. You may remember Barbara.
Well, Jack Yates of the Yates High School, he was a celebrated black leader right after the Civil War.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I didn't know that. But my principal was a fellow who looked white named, I want to say Mr. Ryan, but I don't think that's it. Mr. Holland, Bill Holland. He looked white. He looked like you. Except that he had darker hair. And but he was a firm man who was committed to racial equality. And the school sort of reflected it. And that's when I had to confront racial segregation more directly. I'm from the other side of the tracks, and many of the kids there had parents who taught at Texas Southern and in the public schools, and they otherwise had good jobs working for the oil companies on the fish rigs and things like that. So you had well-to-do here and poor here. I'm coming in the middle of the high school, 11th grade year. These people don't know me. I don't know them. But I'm active, so I get to school, and I become acquainted with people. And some of the people with whom I became acquainted, I spent time with them and their families. It turned out that some of their families these kids that were my friends didn't want to spend time with their parents. And since I'm nerdy, their parents did little things, and they talked to me, and I talked to them. We played cards and things like that. I learned how to play bridge, for instance, and chess. And during some of those conversations that we had, I came up with some of these stupid ideas. I now know they're stupid, about why there should be a racial divide. And this man, after sharing my views, I always share my views. He said, you're one of the most stupid people I've ever known. He said, how can you say that white people need more than black people? When I go to the store, I have to pay the same amount of money for bread that they do. If I buy a car, it has to be the same price. I have to pay the same thing. And if I buy a house and want a decent house, I'd have to pay the same kind of money. If I get a job, I don't know why I should be paid less than I am. I started thinking, I said, damn. I mean, I guess I am stupid. And I started reading. I said, I had to quickly disabuse myself of those kinds of thoughts. And then I started interacting and looking around and reading more and becoming acquainted with people who talked to me. The one thing that didn't happen in Hope, was that we did not have a lot of conversational interaction with adults. I was rather uninitiated in being able to converse with older people. I did my work, and I always respected my elders and went to church and those things. And in order to understand how to get along with people, especially girls. I read Emily Post. I don't know whether you remember Emily Post. And I was told, Emily Post says you don't kiss a girl on the first date. I tried, I lost 2 or 3 girlfriends that way because I didn't try to kiss them. They thought something was wrong with me. But at any rate, in school, I became fairly popular because for some reason or another I knew more than most of them. And my little education at Hope had better prepared me than most of those students in that so-called best high school for blacks in Texas. So I didn't have to go to a lot of classes, but I went, of course, because you were. And I had taught myself in Hope how to type and how to do, that was on the Underwood typewriter. I did that in order to be able to show off. You know how you do. You teach yourself how to do things, then you go and take the class so you know you're going to get an A, and then you out-type the teacher, and I did Greg's, and I did a lot of other things. So I knew how to do a lot of things. So when I went to school there, I already knew a lot of the stuff that they were teaching students in the 11th and 12th grade. So I didn't have to do much reading, and I made virtually all A's. But so these people didn't know who I was, so I'm going back and forth, and I saw that they didn't have a lot of things going on other than the boola stuff, what they could wear in their cars and all. So I upstart a few things like the newspaper and worked on various things. So that at the end of the first year, when student government elections occurred, I was elected president of the student body after 1 year. And that came about because of the divide between the rich and the poor. The poor liked me because I was smart. They thought I was smart, and I had decent grades, and I still interacted, and and then the rich didn't know about me, the well-to-do, but they thought that I was smarter than they. And I knew how, because of some of the posts and other things, to, do the things that, respectable young kids are supposed to do. I didn't know what I was doing. But somehow or another I got along well with everybody and was socially accepted. And then when honors time came, even though I was just one of 3 boys in the group of 30 undergraduates, I was denied honors of scholarships because I hadn't had 3 years of high school there. It goes to the students who have been there the whole time. And the idea, basically, I didn't realize what they were saying, that, well, anybody coming from your little school, those grades don't count as much as the ones coming from this big school. So I'd done well throughout the school system and was near the top of the class. But I couldn't get that.
You must have overcome that because you were accepted at the University of Texas, or you're not.
Well, that's an interesting thing.
I know we had Brown versus Board of Education.
We had Brown that year, and I had been encouraged to go to Southern Illinois University, Pepperdine, and a Midwest school sort of like Oberlin. I didn't know anything about those, and I didn't know. And if I had known, if I'd known then, I would have gone to Malibu. Pepperdine was in Malibu. I didn't know anything about Malibu. But I knew that the University of Texas had a national and an international reputation. And I knew also that it didn't cost much to attend. At that time, the tuition for the University of Texas was $50. So I applied. I knew I could do that myself without scholarship. So I applied, and they admitted me. Brown v. Board of Education was decided exactly 2 weeks from my graduation, before my graduation, May 17, 1954. I think I graduated June 2nd, right before my, June 1st or 2nd, right before my 17th birthday. I like to boast that I graduated at 16, but I graduated at 16 and turned 17 within a day or two, And so I applied without counseling or anything, and they admitted me. And unknown to me, they admitted 5 other black students. One of them during the summer disclosed that he intended not only to attend, but he wanted to play football. That was not known to me. So when I showed up at the university to claim my seat, they told me that I couldn't go there. And
They expect you to be so good at football. They
No, not me. They de-admitted all 5 of us.
that was a joke.
Oh, I did. But at any rate, I had some strange things happen. Right after they told me I couldn't attend university, I got the next day a telegram saying that I'd been admitted to Howard University with a scholarship and several other places. Well, I didn't want to go there, and I filed a lawsuit with a lawyer named Aloysius M. Wycliffe. He was a lawyer there, and another fellow named Tom Dent from Galveston. Wycliffe was from Houston. Dent was from Galveston, and there was a lawyer who had graduated from the University of Texas in law school named Gloria Bradford. You will recall that the case of Sweat versus Painter in 1947 opened up the University of Texas law school to African American students, and that was what caused the University of Arkansas here to open up its law school voluntarily in 1948.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
I'm just trying to keep it in the sequence.
Yeah, but I was de-admitted. They told me that I could go to Prairie View and be a scholarship student. Well, I didn't want to do that. Prairie View was the state's black college. And at that time, I figured out that there weren't a lot of black people in certain things. And by going to the UT, if I got into one of those things, I would have some security and possible prominence. And Texas being an oil state, I decided that I wanted to be a petroleum engineer. Now, they had no other school in the state that taught petroleum engineering. And I figured that I'd become the first black petroleum engineer in the world. Well, that didn't happen, and I didn't go to Prairie View. But while we were filing a lawsuit against the University of Texas,
Is that your first familiarization with litigation?
no, because when I was in high school at Houston, I became more familiar with Walter White in the NAACP, and even joined an NAACP chapter, and found that was an organization devoted to bringing about racial equality, and that they were the ones who were responsible for the Brown decision. And I chose lawyers. I had to pay my lawyers, but these were not NAACP lawyers. But they had an association with them, and they chose to represent me. And they used I had to pay all my little $700 that I'd saved to go to the University of Texas. At that time, that was enough money to keep me there for the whole year. Like I said, tuition $50, and I had my first year taken care of. And it didn't happen. So my uncles had attended college in Pine Bluff in Arkansas, and they insisted on me while I was waiting to be in somebody's college. So I pursued the case through a temporary restraining order, and attended college at the same time until the judge denied the motion for temporary restraining order, saying that I had to wait until the second Brown decision in 1955, when they would tell the states how to go about implementing the 1954 decision. Well, I thought that was unfair. And only later did I find that the real reason I was turned down at that particular time was because the Longhorns were not prepared to admit one of the students who wanted to become a football player. He later on became a dentist in Houston, Texas. But he didn't get to play football for the Longhorns. At that time, they were the premier football team in what was then the Southwest Conference. I don't know whether you remember that.
How did all this melt into Arkansas M&N?
Well, I got there at Pine Bluff.
How did you get directed toward Pine Bluff?
Well, my uncles had attended there. My father's brothers were all college graduates, and each had attended there after having gone to service. They were beneficiaries of the bill, of the GI Bill, and I stayed with one of them for 2 years. I enrolled in the middle of the year. They had at that time a quarter rather than a semester system, so that meant that I started off behind. And because I was waiting to get in the University of Texas, I didn't take regular classes. I started off taking senior classes. So I took classes with some people who later became Arkansas luminaries, and I worked myself down from being a senior to being a freshman. When I graduated taking freshman orientation. So I started off taking senior courses and worked my way down. Those were prerequisites for graduation. It worked out well because I shifted majors and concerns. I encountered people who were friendly, and had a special friend who had attended Yerga High School, who was also the chairman of the sociology department at Pine Bluff UA. It was then called Arkansas Agricultural, Mechanical, and Normal College for Negroes. And he had attended, as I say, Yerga, and had graduated from A&M College, and had received a PhD from University of Chicago at a time when the University of Chicago was regarded as the best university in the world. And so I came back, and he befriended me. I went into the sociology department and did well in the department, and then worked on became a debater and things like that. And I learned a lot, even though I played a lot. My grades went down I started off with A's, and by the time I got down to my freshman year, which is the 4th year, I was doing B's and C's, you know. I think I got a C in freshman orientation.
I have an idea that you were involved in a lot of civil rights activities taking place in
I
Little
did.
Rock.
No, I was involved in them in school there. And I became involved with them with the National Student Association. And that's the...
Didn't we have the Little Rock crisis and all that
No, wait a
occurring?
minute, I'll tell you about that. But before the Little Rock crisis, I met Wiley Branton
Yes.
and George Howard. And in 1956, with their encouragement and my initiative, we sought to desegregate and integrate the pools in Pine Bluff and the buses and everything. And I recall very vividly trying to deal with the pools in the white community. I remember getting a group of 15 people to go with me over to the white pool. By the time we got there, there were 3 of us. The others sort of said no. And I go and I try to get in, and they said, "We're not serving your can. We're not admitting your can." My aunt, who had dropped me off, had taken off, so they left me and the other 2 people there. I think it was just one by that time. His name was Alexander Sykes. They wouldn't let me in. But I started thinking, what would I do if they let me in? I didn't have the admission fee of 25 cents, nor could I swim. So George Howard, their idea was, you have to have test cases. Somebody has to be the sacrifice. So I was going to be a test case for dealing with the buses and also for the pools and the like. Well, it turned out that Pine Bluff decided to voluntarily integrate the buses. That was occurring during the same time King and the Montgomery boycott were occurring. So they opened that up. And then what they decided to do was close the white swimming pool. That was their way of addressing the issue. So in one way we accomplished our purpose, in another way we didn't. But the idea was you had to get arrested. So I was not averse to being arrested. And that was an NAACP initiative. And
Let me interject here that if you need a break at any point, just let us know.
I'm fine. Look,
Okay.
I can go as long as you can, probably.
I don't doubt it.
Well, that's what old folk do. You know, they sit around and reminisce. But some of these things are reminders now of things that happened later of similar nature. I recall that 2 years after those encounters and the Montgomery boycott and our boycott, Martin Luther King was my commencement speaker in 1958. If I fast forward to 1964, I was the class marshal and led the class in for graduation at Yale University Law School. And the person who was the main speaker, again, was Martin Luther King, who received an honorary degree from Yale that year. That was a big honor, even though, I didn't realize how big it was at the time. Sometimes when you're in things at the moment, you do not understand their significance, and it takes time in order to have them placed into at least historical perspective, if not other perspective. But that got me to Pine Bluff, and from there, I had only limited interaction with white people, and it did. I was a senior, and I was entering my senior class, at least last year of my college, in 1957. That was the year of the crisis. I was editor of the newspaper, and I was threatened with expulsion because I wrote a critical editorial, which I caused to be published in the Arkansas-ier against Orville Faubus. After I did that, the president and everybody of the college and everybody became real concerned, and people started staying away from me. And they all of a sudden had no more money for any more publications of the Arkansas-ier for that year. I think I had one more publication. But the next year, because of my distinguished professor from Hope and one of his peers from Waco, Texas, who had also attended the University of Chicago, Dr. William Phillips, they were members of the board of the Arkansas Council on Human Relations. I was hanging around Pine Bluff because my girlfriend at that time was attending summer school. I didn't have a job, nor was I in hot pursuit of one. I was in hot pursuit of her. And finally, when I decided that I really need a job in order to continue pursuit of her, they helped me get a job with what's called the Arkansas Council of Human Relations, on Human Relations, in Little Rock as the assistant director. They were on the board.
I want to insist that you at least get some water. Can you call somebody and get some water brought in?
Don't worry about it. Or you want to take a break?
Let's go off just for a minute.
One of you asked me about my recollection of Dr. King's speech at Yale.
We did when we were off camera, though.
When we were off camera, and I recall his speech to my college class more so than I do my Yale class. And at that time, he had not become, he was well known, and the movement was in its infancy, and that was 1958. He was just a person at that time that people were beginning to look to sort of help lead us out of bondage. And he was inspirational. And he talked much about the Montgomery boycott and about what was to later become a title of one of his books. I think it was called Strive Toward Freedom. And at Yale, he talked about the relationship of race, the relationship between race and poverty, as I recall, and justice. And he challenged us to recall the need for mission-oriented lawyers to address the evils of society. That was in 1964. And of course, everybody was enamored by him. And of course, I was proud. There were 6 black people in my class out of 166 or 7. You know, it creates a great sense of pride when the most distinguished person among the luminaries who were present happens to be a person of your own race who comes from the same background as you. And I guess we all came from the same background. He was just one generation removed from it before me. You know, I don't know what to say other than that I was very proud and very honored, and we were all. And at that time, I had become acquainted with people who espoused the same kind of commitment as King, many of whom had worked with King. I had worked with King. That I worked for the Justice Department with Bobby Kennedy and John Doerr as an intern for the summer '63, '64. In '62 and '63, I worked for the Voter Project, where I became acquainted with King. And we had the responsibility for identifying sites in the South to distribute Ford Foundation and other foundation money to various places where we could enhance voter registration. The Justice Department had taken on a case against Alabama. I think it resulted in a case called U.S. v. Alabama, where John Doerr was a lead counsel and Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General. And so I identified more with King because I'd had the association and the privilege of going with another staffer of Wiley Branton to King's office to deliver a check. And for me, that was a big check of like $5,000 to help with voter registration in Atlanta. But we went to various places. Now, it seemed like a lot of money, and it probably was. Didn't have but like $300,000, I think, to be distributed and to operate on. But in 1964, that was a lot of money. I recall delivering a check to Barbara Jordan down in Houston that same year in 1961, 62, yeah. It was the summer of '62. So when he was our graduation speaker, you know, it just doubled my pride. Now, you'd ask me what was that like? I've given the best explanation I can.
Well, tell us about your time at Yale as a student.
Well, I was about to say that when I was there, I was accidentally there, by the way, but when I was there, it became the best experience of my life. Some of my associates, I figured, you know, I sort of slipped into class. I didn't think I was supposed to be there. So when I'd go into class as a merit student, I would either have to take the front row or the back row. Well, I didn't know whether I was prepared or not, more often than not, so I went to the back row. First time I got in one of the classes. And sitting next to me was a young fellow named William Nolan. And he was also from Arkansas, Union County. Little did I know that he was a and heir to the Murphy fortune. And he later became chairman of the board of Murphy Oil. And later on, a friend of Bill Clinton's. You remember his wife was appointed by Bill Clinton, University of Arkansas, Board of Trustees. Well, he was there, and in due course, I became very friendly with a number of the people who didn't make law review. The people, you knew some of the people who were going to be law review. I didn't know anything about law review and how it stood, but I did know after, that you had to do your work and all. And I was always dubious about my capacity to remain there. But the good thing about Yale was that once they admitted you, they made sure that you were retained, and they encouraged you to do well and gave you the support necessary. And I became friends with Gary Hart, among others, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Marion Wright Edelman.
You take any boat rides with Gary Hart?
I didn't. I wish I had. He would have been president of the United States had I done so. He would not have been on the monkey business with Donna Rice. Or not, I don't think that's the name is Donna Rice, Donna something. And Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown was, his father at that time was governor of California. And there were a lot of other persons who were very bright, but none of them stood out in my first year as much as the person who went on to become the nation's best-known lawyer for a long time. He's a distinguished professor of law at Harvard now. What's his name? He helped with the O.J. Simpson defense.
Yeah, he's in the news all the time right
yeah,
now.
he
He's
is.
taking some positions.
He does.
Call his name, somebody call his
It'll
name.
come to me. But he was
Dershowitz.
Alan
Dershowitz.
Dershowitz. I was a freshman in Professor J. Willie Moore's class in federal procedure. You remember Moore's federal procedure?
Moore's federal.
And Moore was a professor, and Dershowitz and Moore held class many times. And he was in his third year at the time.
Moore wrote the book, Moore's Federal Practice, that's in here somewhere.
Oh yeah, I had it. He was at that time the leading person on federal procedure in the United States. And I recall, I looked at him. I said, "How could a man who looks like Porky Pig be so eminent?" But he was. And but there we had good interaction. I knew Mr. Bork, and a number of the professors. One of them was named Tom Emerson. They called him there Tommy the Commie. And Fred Rodell, I don't know whether you remember Fred Rodell. He was the eminent authority on the Supreme Court through the 80s, I guess. But the Yale experience was just wonderful. We had good students, good interaction, and they seemed mostly devoted to civil rights, even though there were people going back to my National Student Association days who were on the right. And one of them that I met in my National Student Association days, even though he was out of school, was Bill Buckley. So, I've now come full circle to an extent. I've come from the Buckley kind of mentality that everybody has a place and black folks are supposed to be over here, all the way to be a full-fledged ally of Martin Luther King and the causes for which he stood, and still am, I guess.
Okay, we're gonna move. I think you've covered pretty well your educational background and all the things that occurred up to that point. If we haven't, just interject.
We're fine.
But we're going to go now probably to your legal practice, which started in '64.
And well, I finished law school in '64. Went to work for the Legal Defense Fund later that year.
I just want to ask one question,
Sure.
and then Mr. Hodges will take over about specific things because
Sure.
he should remember a lot of it, having been an observer for a longer period than I have. Although I've been admiring John from a distance for a long time, even when I was young. But there's a story that you've told me that I think is fascinating, and it's about when you started practicing law and you had a integrated law firm in Little Rock, and you were before a judge who I think was probably around El Dorado or Texarkana. We just won't even call his name right now, I suppose, but you had a predicament that grew that involves several other lawyers, and it was so interesting to me. I'd just like for you to tell that story.
Well, there are several. I guess you're talking about the one, I don't mind calling the judge's name, that involved Judge Goodson in Arkadelphia. A number of students at Henderson State University protested racial discrimination in and around Henderson around '73. At the time, other protests were going on. And Richard Mays went down to represent one or more of the students who had been arrested. And while he was there, Judge Goodson found him in contempt of court. And he told him if he persisted, he'd continue to find him in contempt. So the second time he found him in contempt, he fined him $50, I'm told. I wasn't there at the time because Richard was handling this on his own. And Richard went in his pocket and put out $50. And then he went on and he continued. And
Now, Richard was a black lawyer.
he was a black lawyer in my
Still
firm. We had the firm of Walker, Kaplan, and Mays. He was a partner. Well, he went, someone called me to tell me that Richard was in trouble. So I get Les Hollingsworth, who was in the firm as well, and we take off from Little Rock to Arkadelphia. And along the way, we had a flat. And we had to take time out to address the flat. But when we got there, Richard had been held in contempt for maybe the 5th time. And but there were more students being tried, so we proceeded to assist with the trial, and ultimately I took it over. And at that time, there was a similar trial going on in Chicago, and the judge up there was putting people in jail. It dealt with the Chicago 7. You remember that? And so when we finished our trial here, and the judge and the jury, I guess, convicted our people, at the end of the trial, the judge said that he wanted us to stay around because he had another order to enter. And at the end of the trial, he entered an order disbarring Walker, Kaplan, and Mays for 1 year from practicing law because of the positions that we had taken in defense of our clients. I don't know whether you remember that. That was around 74. You can pull it up. It's a reported case. And he stayed his order pending appeal. And at that time, even though we were high profile and the like, a group of distinguished white lawyers came to our defense. They included Oscar Findler from Blytheville, David Solomon from Helena, a fellow from Fayetteville, whose name escapes me right now, Herschel Friday of Little Rock. Can you imagine that? He's my adversary in the school case, but he came in the Supreme Court a few months later summarily reversed the judge. That judge thereafter got off all our cases forever. And his son went on to become a class action lawyer who's probably the most distinguished class action lawyer in Arkansas right now, who's
Well,
married to one of the justices on the Arkansas Supreme
Distinguished and
Court.
successful are separate terms.
I would say, I said distinguished. He's distinguished as being successful. I don't know how important he is.
I just wanted that because that to me typifies what you were dealing with at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And all of you were,
We were all disbarred.
yeah.
And our firm was an interracial firm. That meant Phil Kaplan was disbarred too. I don't think Phil would like to have that. You know, if you know Phil, you would not like to. He would not like to be reminded of that.
Okay, your career has been a storied career of success in the civil rights movement in Little Rock. I don't think there's any question, but your name would come up first in any consideration of it, even though several of these people you've mentioned have been very close friends of mine too. I just want you to start reviewing from 1964 or 5 or whenever you actually started putting your.
Well, let me tell you what happened when I came here from the Legal Defense Fund. To open my practice, the Legal Defense Fund aided me in doing so by giving me a set of books and a stipend of $400 a month. I had but that was enough to live on, provided I had a little revenue coming in. And my first set of cases came about as I was coming from New York to Little Rock, when I was intercepted by a funeral director and a producer of embalming fluid from Forest City, Arkansas, who came to Memphis to get me off the plane. 450 children had been arrested in Forest City. And George Howard and all the lawyers in Arkansas had said they didn't want to have anything to do with it because these kids had torn up, I think it was Lincoln High School in Forest City, Arkansas, in their demand to go over to the white high school. So because they had insisted upon going there, they were all arrested, and they were placed in the jails, filling up all the jails. And they had so many people arrested until they had to drain the swimming pool in the white community and put a number there, and they erected a barbed wire fence for the others. When I got to the courtroom, I'd never been in court by myself, but there were like 25 state troopers in their blue uniforms. And we were before Fletcher Long's father. He was Fletcher Long, who was a prosecutor, and a municipal judge, whose name will come to me. And they were trying those children 23 at a time. I got there just after they tried 23. Now, I didn't know what to do, so I filed a motion. I asked for an opportunity to represent them, and then I asked for a continuance. And I think that they were relieved to give me a continuance because they didn't know what to do with all these kids. And then I thought I knew a little bit of law because at that time, because of King's initiatives and the like, the Fifth Circuit had set up a lot of law because of the great judges over there then. They had a number of great judges in the Fifth Circuit. And they had laws that allowed you to remove a case from a state court into federal court. So I go and look at the removal law while the continuance is pending, and I get all these cases removed to federal court before Judge Young. You remember Gordon Young? He was from Pine Bluff. So Judge Young has me trying all these cases for about 6 months. Whenever he could fit them in, kids were coming from over there, and I was going back interviewing kids. And we tried the cases for a long time, and then he ruled against us on every one of them. Well, then I, of course, filed notice of appeal. I didn't know much about appeal. I don't know what you do about appeal, so I asked the people to help. They said, well, you got to ask for a transcript. The people in the Legal Defense Fund, you got to ask for a transcript. So I a lady named Ella West. I don't know whether you remember her. She was a court reporter for Judge Young. And she refused to do the transcript. And then Judge Young ordered her to do the transcript. She refused to do it. Then the Court of Appeals directed her to do the transcript, and she refused to do it. She was an elderly, cranky lady. So she refused to do the transcript. So the Court of Appeals judges, not wanting to sanction her with jail or a huge fine, directed the lawyers to get together and create the transcript. So that means that all of us had to get together and create transcripts of 450 trials. Now, you can imagine what kind of a task that was. So, rather than create those transcripts, the other side decided to join with me in filing a motion to dismiss all the cases. We got all those cases dismissed. Now, I didn't know anything about the business side of law. I would have done really well if I had charged each one of those students $10 or $50. I would have been really prominent and been well-to-do. I didn't charge them anything, and we in the Legal Defense Fund helped pay all the costs. So that was my first set of cases, and because of the time and the attention and the unusual process of getting a case removed from state court into federal court, and this being the home of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate general, you know, it got a lot of attention, and that sort of launched my career. And that was one case that I mentioned to you. Another one, David, that I mentioned to you was in the criminal law area. And you may remember this. In 1969 or 70, when Horace Mann was in its last year, at the end of the school year, a number of the black students who were graduating went to the Sandbar out on the Arkansas River over here off Rebsman Park. And there, they came up on some white people who were smoking pot, among other things. And two of the white girls, at least two, maybe three, claimed that these boys attacked them and raped them. 6 boys were accused of rape. We called them the Sandbar Six. Well, the white community was in an uproar, and the black community was too, because they thought the boys were being being, just
Blackmail.
not blackmailed. They were just being, well, the word left me. I had it for a moment.
Framed.
Not stronger than that. But at any rate,
Railroaded.
And so I took those cases, and Wiley Brennan helped me with them. At the time we took over the cases, the boys were being held where we couldn't see them. They were being brutalized for confessions and the like. And I didn't know much about how confessions were obtained from people. But that's when I learned how they take testicles and squeeze them. They take needles and pins and put them under your fingernails. They bend you over and take dildos and put them in your anal part. They do all kinds of things in addition to beating. Well, we were able to get a dentist here named Dr. Jerry Jewell to bond them all out. And we went to trial on all of the cases. And those trials occurred, but we had one test defendant. They were never able to get a conviction in 5 trials. The first one ended in mistrial. Most of them ended in mistrials. or something like that. And after about 5 years, Jim Guy Tucker became the prosecuting attorney. And Jim Guy said that, well, we need to bring this to a head for the sake of community peace. So he offered to compromise the cases. Well, at that time, I'm a no-compromise person. My people aren't guilty. We had 51 days of trial. We had 3 special judges. One of them was Judge Means from Malvern, and another was a liberal fellow from Little Rock who was decided, Steele Hayes. You remember Steele was a special judge to try the cases, and he had a reputation of being a pretty fair guy. But we had these trials, and since neither side could prevail, Jim Guy Tucker decided, and I, that we would try to compromise the cases. And of course, I didn't want a conviction for these boys and for them to go to jail. I didn't believe they were guilty. And it wasn't my call. But at that time, I made it my call. And that's one of the things that probably separates me from some of the other lawyers. I too much identified with my clients. I became, in effect, the client and the lawyer. And that's not a good thing to do, I guess. But nonetheless, I took on their concerns. So I didn't want a conviction on my records, and I didn't want one for them. So what we did was we entered into an agreement where the boys would enter a plea of an attempt to rob, for which they would get no time and no fine. And then the next day, they could come back to the courthouse and have their records expunged. Now, I determined that that was as good a deal as anybody could ever get, because they have no long-lasting record. They did not get a rape conviction, however you look at it for posterity. And they had their futures secure. I thought that was a tremendous success. Jim Guy went on to parlay that opportunity, along with some others, into the event of becoming Arkansas's governor, I think 6 years later. Attorney General first, I guess, and then governor. That was a significant case. I've had several others, if you'd want to inquire about them.
Well, David jotted down something. Were you going to ask a question about some specific thing?
Well, I wanted you to sort of take us through how you got involved in the litigation with the city of Little Rock and the Little Rock School District, and sort of take it from the beginning to the end, if you would.
I will. I'll do that.
There is no.
When I worked for the Council on Human Relations, that was my first real experience with white people. I worked with a fellow named Nat Griswold and became acquainted with all these white luminaries who were moderate in the community, who called themselves trying to save the schools. Mrs. David Terry, whose husband was a congressman, a lady named Mrs. Scott, not Scott, she was from Scott, Mrs. Brewer, Vivian Brewer, Charlie Johnson, Fred Dara, people like that. Dara was a businessman who prided himself in being friendly to Daisy Bates. And we had our office at 1221 West Capitol, 2 blocks from the Capitol. And we worked at that time in 1958 to try to promote racial healing and understanding between black and white people. So my task as a black person of the team to do it was to become acquainted with these black people who were so-called leaders, while Nat Griswold was trying to work with the business community to cause them to have some degree of sanity and to try to work to get the schools open, but to try to do it from the basis of the rightness of the deal rather than just having a deal done that would reopen the schools. And that way I became acquainted with many people who became my friends, most of whom were much older. Remember, now I'm 21 years old at that time. And I worked with Daisy to try to encourage more black kids to get into the white schools. I'm really aggressive. You'll see there are several little books that are written about our efforts to try to get more kids in the school. But what stands out the most for me was that when we would take these kids, they had to run the gauntlet of what was called the Arkansas Pupil Placement Act. The legislature said that in order for black kids to go to white schools, they had to they had to meet each of 17 criteria. And those criteria included coming from families that were good, no criminal record, parents had to have jobs, all kinds of things that had no relationship to education. And then the kids had to apply, and then they had to be interviewed by the school board. So I got a lot of these kids in to apply. We had more than 150 kids apply. Now, in Little Rock, I'd never seen black people do anything in numbers of more than one or two, but I got a lot of them. And I had the cooperation from Nat Griswold in that respect, and also Daisy Bates. And as these kids went in for their interviews under the pupil placement law, Herschel Friday and a lawyer named Robert Light, I don't know whether you remember Bob Light, represented the school district. And what motivated me to go to law school, in small part, at least some part, was that after they'd come out with, after they would reject a student, they'd go into a closed room. I couldn't go in with them. The parent could go in with them, but no lawyer. And I wasn't a lawyer anyway. So Bob would come out. You know, he was a heavy smoker. He'd come out and take a puff on a cigarette. Well, we got another one. Smile, well, we got another one. Well, we got another one. That means he was taking pride in denying these kids an opportunity to get a more integrated education, if not a better education. So part of my motivation for going to law school was that, even though I didn't understand at that time that I would wind up going. So that's when I started working with, I was working with the council. Now, the way I got to law school is most interesting if you want to know that. It was because of the interracial associations with the Arkansas Council on Human Relations and the Methodist Church. I had been the first black chairman of the South Central Jurisdiction Regional Methodist Youth Fellowship. You familiar with MYF? Well, they have 5 or 6 regions, and we met up in Mount Sequoia, and they didn't let black people go on top of Mount Sequoia at that time. You know where Mount Sequoia is? I got up there, and they made me vice chairman and the next year chairman. I didn't believe that would happen, but they did, and several things were integrated. But because I was a Methodist and working with the Council on Human Relations, I went to the first national conference on human relations at Southern Methodist University in 1959. And there I met the fellow named Dan Dotson, who was Branch Rickey's point man for the integration of Jackie Robinson into baseball. This big, gangling white man comes up to me with this Southern Texas voice. I just want to find this fella from Little Rock, Arkansas, that these white folk from Mississippi have been around here talking about. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he introduced himself. I learned that he was head of the New York University Center for Human Relations Studies, and he told me that these people from Mississippi had met me, and they were impressed that I could talk to them and not and not stir away from them and look them in the eyes and conduct a decent conversation with them and even have points of view. They were just ecstatic. They didn't think black folk were like that. I didn't know that they had that impression. But Dan was, and some of the others were impressed by what some of them had thought. So Dan on the spot offered me a scholarship to New York University and gave me the papers to apply through the John Hay Whitney Opportunity Fellowship Program. I would have the choice to come there or go to Berkeley. And I chose to go there with him. And I did. And that's what, and I stayed there for a year and got my master's degree. And while there, I met a friend. I mean, this is white people, so I can't really be totally negative to white people, however you look at race. And I may say you two gentlemen contribute to my attitude about race as well. But nonetheless, while there, I met a lady named Doris Horowitz, who was a very good friend of Jackie Robinson and Rachel Robinson, who lived in Stamford, Connecticut. And she was talking to me toward the end of the application period in 1960 about what I was going to do after finishing. And I told her I'd rather go to law school, but it looks like I'm going to have to be one of these talking doctors and get a PhD or an EDD and go in and work as a social worker type. She says, "Oh, you want to go to law school?" I told her I didn't have the money. She says, "Oh, you'd be good." She says, "I can get you an interview at Yale." I said, "Shut up." The only thing I could do is say, "No, you can't." Well, she did, and she got me an interview with Fowler Harper, who was at that time the king of tarts before Prosser. And he introduced me to a one-armed man from Tennessee who was the director of admissions named Jack Tate. And Tate said, "Well, Mr. Walker, we haven't had much experience with folk from your college." And he said, "But New York University is a pretty good little school. And if we get your grades from New York University and they're all right, then we'll maybe consider taking you. We'll let you know during the summer." About a month later, I got an acceptance to Yale University. Now, I think all of that goes back to my two things: my becoming a good advocate for racial equity and justice, and because I was connected to both black and white people, none of whom were committed to retention of the status quo. Now, when I got there, everything was fine. I never had a problem at Yale University. I didn't have much money. They told me, Mr. Tate said, "Well, Mr. Walker, if we admit you, we know you don't have any money, but we'll find a way to keep you here." And they did, with gifts and grants. From all places, there's a green stamp company, S&H Green Stamps. The owner of the green stamp company had given a considerable amount of money to Yale University, to which Yale devoted for scholarships and for student aid. So when I left there, I think I had all my debts and everything paid but like $8,000. And they gave me a 1 or 2% plan for paying it, and it took me 10 or 12 years to pay it back, but I did.
So you went through Yale Law School on S&H stamp.
Well, some of them, S&H, and some, and a lot of other assistants. Jack Tate from Tennessee, one-armed man, he saw to it. And there was a dean named Rostow, Walt Rostow, I think his name. He was the brother of Walt Rostow. Walt Rostow was was the Assistant Secretary of State. They saw to it that I and a few other black students there were able to be financially comfortable. So we finished. I finished.
Let me go back now to when you were with the Little Rock School District. You had those kids that had to go through the rigorous selection process. Take us from that point forward historically in the litigation you had and the involvement you had with battling the schools.
Well, here's what happened. My commitment in going there was to come back here. So when I went to Yale Law School, my commitment, both to myself and to the people at the council, was that I'm coming back. You don't have a lawyer here to help. So when I finished in 64, my commitment was to come back in 65. At that time, the Little Rock case was known as Aaron v. Cooper. Its citation for reference is 358 U.S. 1, as I recall. Judge Young was the judge, and Wiley Brandon was still the primary, the lead lawyer. Well, Wiley wanted to turn it over to me. But so we decided to change the style of the case from Cooper v. Aaron to Clark versus the Board of Education of the Little Rock School District. So if you look at the history of Cooper, it becomes Clark v. Board of Education in 1965. And from 1965, I basically became lead counsel, though Wiley's name remained on the papers while he went various places, in addition to becoming Dean of Howard Law School. So I've had that case, and I intended to have that finished in 5 years or less. And that 5 has turned into 50. That was 1965, so it's now 53 years since I've been on this same damn case. And it's the only case that I know that's been settled a half dozen times, and yet never settled, because of the nature of the relief, the changing composition of the United States Supreme Court, and their changing views about affirmative relief for victims of past discrimination, and the slow whittling away at the premises of Brown v. Board of Education. So while Brown is now still the lead case on discrimination and opens up everything, it no longer has any real vitality.
Because of the definitions of vestiges of...
No, it's because of judges like Kavanaugh who believe that you can, for race discrimination, not use race to overcome past vestiges, which is yes, in a way. And so there are a few judges who still give support to the concept of affirmative action. Brown was an affirmative action case. It said that in order to, once you find discrimination, you have to find a remedy for it. And one way you address past vestiges is by using the same thing that got you there to change it. And that's no longer really widely popular on the United States Supreme Court. That's the big fight now in terms of the Supreme Court nominees for the balance of power for that 5th vote on affirmative action. You need 2 more in order to secure it, but it's now 6-3 the other way. If maybe 5-4, but 6-3 probably.
John's been narrating this for 2 hours about, and I don't know when it would start to be taxing on him.
Well, if you're still able to.
Well, I'd
briefly.
indicated that I stay a couple of hours. If you find what I have,
There's one question I want to ask.
Go ahead.
From one icon in our state about another icon in our state, you must tell us about your litigation with Frank Broyles.
Well, that's really interesting. One of the first cases that I filed when I returned to Little Rock is styled Robert Whitfield and Joanna Edwards against the University of Arkansas. It was filed in 1965 and 1966. Whitfield was a Little Rock student who was denied equal access to all privileges and benefits, including housing at Fayetteville. And I filed on their behalf a comprehensive case seeking to eliminate all vestiges of discrimination at Fayetteville. 5 months later, a lawyer from the university entered into a consent decree with me to eliminate all vestiges of discrimination in everything at the university, including athletics. Now, at that time, Broyles had never had any black football players. The university had not had any varsity athletes who were black. While at the Council on Human Relations, Nat Griswold and I tried to get a young man named Eddie Miles, who attended Jones High School, admitted to the University of Arkansas.
What year?
1959.
Okay.
And we went up there, and the coach, I forget who he was at the time, said, well, I can't admit him, but if he enrolls in school and then he walks on, as good as he is, we know he'll make the team and we'll have no choice but to play him. Well, they wouldn't give him a commitment. And Elgin Baylor was at Seattle at the time, a dominant player. And we connected Eddie Miles with Elgin Baylor. And Eddie went to Seattle. And he became an All-American basketball player. And he left there and he went to play with Detroit. And he became known as the man with the golden arm. He became All-Pro. And he became All-Pro until he injured his Achilles heel. But that was a player that would have put Arkansas on the map in 1959 and 1960. But Broyles refused to play black people. And he was racist, in my opinion, to the core. But he knew how to play the game, and he developed black friends. What I learned back then was that the most racist people always had their black friends. People who would believe in them. And what usually happened was that through their paternity, the black people mistook that for being friends of on an equal basis, which was really not the case. But they became, because white people befriended them and invited them to their homes occasionally, they became supporters of them. Broyles developed a number of those people. But I don't know how you can develop a number of those people and become friends with them and refuse to play black players or to recruit them for so long. It was the late 60s before John Richardson was allowed to come to Fayetteville.
But my friend Darrell Brown had walked on.
Darrell had walked on, and they treated him abysmally.
Yeah.
And
I witnessed that.
And Darrell, I don't think ever really overcame that in some respects, even though he was successful. But that was something that hurt him greatly, because he had met all the standards that he had been taught that mattered if you were a citizen of the United States, and if you were entitled to the same rights with white people. And he made it his business to get along well with white people, but to remain, and Broyles mistreated him. He may not have called him a, quote, nigger to his face, unquote, but that was a regular part of his vocabulary. Now, he knew when not to use it. And at some times he couldn't help but use it. So I don't know how he could become this great person with
But you represent
no,
Nolan
no. He basically
in your biggest fight. Was
well, the point there was he was an evil man, and Nolan was a good man, and Nolan was a man. I mean, the definition of a man is one who sees himself that way and as an equal. And Nolan knew that it was his time to become the athletic director at Fayetteville. That's the way you move up. And if he'd had another successful season, Frank knew, since Nolan was the only national champion the university ever had in anything other than track, that there would be great pressure on Frank. So Frank had to fire him. And I don't know whether I was up to the task of representing him. I believe I was, but I believe that prejudice is very ingrained, and even some of the people who view themselves as very liberal find it very hard to separate themselves from those fundamental necessities of being white. It's a necessity of being white to uphold white institutions, of which Frank Broyles was one. So I believe Billy Roy, Judge Billy Roy, probably not as consciously as some would think, decided that he'd find a way to rule for Frank. And he came up with an excuse which said that even though the man's racist, you can't just take that and impute that general overall attitude to a specific act in this case. You not only have to show the tendency to be racial, you had to show that that attitude permeated or was responsible for the specific act that was here involved. So he rationalized that there was insufficient intent to link him in such a way as to favor Nolan.
John, I know we've been a while, but I know how difficult it was for us to get you to sit down, so I'm going to keep going a little bit because there are two areas I want to cover with you.
Go right ahead.
I want you to tell me and everybody that looks at this video how it was like for you to be a lawyer and go through Arkansas from the time you were admitted in the middle 60s until the present time, and how that evolved and how people treated you and how you got along and how you made your way through the obstacles that were there.
I'd be happy to try to tell you that. Haven't thought too much about it. When I came, black lawyers were not held in high repute. Wiley Brenton had left the state, and George Howard was held in the highest repute. The oldest of the black lawyers had been disbarred, only to be, reinstated some years later. That's Judge Flowers. He became Judge Flowers. And I identified with those people. And at the same time, I was associated with the white bar, Pulaski County and otherwise. And I was accepted pretty much by the white bar. I think that in the white bar you had a lot of liberal young lawyers. Clay Patty was young at that time, John Sizemore, Jim Youngdahl. Even though they were older, Henry Woods and people like that. And they they sort of welcomed someone in the black community working to try to eradicate discrimination. And they, in one way or another, became my allies for a while, including Henry Woods. And didn't take actions to diminish me for a long time. So I was able to, I think, encourage other black people to go to law school and to rapidly increase the number of black applicants in the law school. Now, I don't know that they'll attribute that to my advocacy, but I did encourage that. And all of a sudden, we moved from 6 black lawyers in Pulaski County and maybe 8 in the state to 100 within a few years. And so I had continuous activity trying to eradicate barriers. And I must say that I paid the cost of most of my litigation. Didn't make any money from it. All the cases involving Little Rock I paid for the longest. And Herschel Friday and Robert Light and all the other lawyers representing the school districts made huge profits. But I would go for years without getting anything, and then the courts would always cut down on my fees and disregard my time. So for cases that they may have received $100,000 for, I may have, in the final analysis, wound up losing $5,000. So I made them plenty of money. And the bar members sort of liked me too, in part, because my work allowed me to allowed them to have their own esteem raised. Herschel Friday and his firm were charging between $30 and $50 an hour when I came here. And that kept them so busy until they got more work. And then I had the gall to ask Judge Arnold in a reported case to help pay a fee for me of $125 an hour. That was in the early 70s. And I think the name of the case is Taylor v. Jones, and he didn't give it to me, but he did award me a fee of $75 an hour. Now, at that time, the fee rate was between $30 and $45. Well, that means all these premier lawyers raised their fees to $50 and then to $75 an hour. And later on, when I got my fee established by the court to be $125 an hour the next year, then they raised theirs to $125. And later, I got the court to award me a fee of $325 an hour. Lawyers who'd been charging $100, $150, $200 an hour, they all of a sudden are making plenty of money. Now, I don't get that unless I win. They get that simply because they represent somebody and they bill. And it was so disgusting to me because I'd go into court and I'm the only person representing a party. And there'd be 10 lawyers there against me representing adversary parties. And most of them never said anything. And there I don't get paid, but all 10 of them are making this $300 an hour that I call them to make. And then they go out in the public and say, Walker's making all this money, when I'm basically having to pay for their costs. It was all right. Because at that time I was concerned about helping to make law and to change things in the society. And that's the reason I worked for so long. And that's still part of my motivation. But I got along pretty well with all of those folk until Walker Kaplan and Mays broke up, which I fault myself for to an extent by not having enough capacity to reconcile differences of opinions. And egos get in the way when you have firms. But that left me with hundreds of cases. These are all your cases, Walker, so you keep them. So there I am before Judge Roy in 78. And she wants to get rid of all these cases. They had sent 7 judges from the Court of Appeals down here to deal with the backlog of cases, sitting as district judges. And so I was alerted by Jim Youngdahl that she was going to have a class action hearing on a case where he and I were involved. And then she was going to recess it and require me to go to another class action hearing the same day. And she did. And at that time, I made a statement to her that she perceived as accusing her of being racial. So she chastised me from the bench instead of holding me in contempt, and then got off that case that I was on before her, and then came back the next day and got off all my cases. And at that time, the weight of the bar came down on me. Henry Woods, my friend, and these other lawyers, and the Democrat, black people stay away from John Walker. He's a pariah. And that's because I didn't realize how entrenched sexism was. And sexism, in some ways, is as entrenched, if not more so, than racism. But at this time, for my racial friends who were liberal, somewhat liberal, the fact that she said I attacked her caused all of them to come to the defense of Judge Elsie Jane Roy. All of them except one judge.
Isley. Henry Woods.
Judge Howard.
Judge Howard was always in my corner. But remember, this was like 1978. Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976. He was a one-termer. And before he left his term, you remember, he was determined to have at least one black judge in every southern state. Judge Howard wasn't appointed until 79. So he had not come there yet. The one judge was the most racist. It was Orrin Harris in El Dorado. And he and I had all kind of fights. I accused him of using the word nigger and calling me nigger in court. George and I had a case known as Kemp versus Beasley, the El Dorado school case. And he said, I did not say, Mr. Walker, that I didn't use the word nigger. I said nigger. And George told me to sit down. I had to get up. I said, Judge, nigger and nigger are the same thing. The gentleman will be seated. And he had the marshal come and stand next to me. I said, okay. But later on, Judge Harris made good rulings for me in a number of cases. And he said, he indicated to me and others that he thought Judge Roy was wrong, and that I had been most respectful to him. He supported me without opposing her. But at that time, he was 80 years old. I guess that was 1980. So that was 38 years ago. So he would have been 70 if he were living now. He would be 30 years older than I, 40 years old. So he would be like 120, I guess.
One other thing I want to cover, and I know it's getting late, but I wanted to get you to tell me and anybody that looks at this video the experience with the jury trials. And the jury, we know that's the bedrock of our democracy. You got to, and you've talked about it, how they didn't convict the kids on the Sandbar Six, and that sort of helped you.
Yep.
But I want to go and talk about African Americans as it relates to civil, criminal jury trials, and then how the experience has been since you practiced law through the present time, the reception, whether it's changed, gotten better, gotten worse.
I'd be happy to address that. I must say to begin with that I don't have a great record of success with juries. I have won cases before juries, but I've usually had a basis for a reversal, and that's very hard in jury cases because of the rule that says whatever juries decide is usually going to be upheld unless clearly erroneous. Now, and the law developed that it can't really be clearly erroneous if you have 2 points of view, and if a jury takes one. And so I've been able to find ways to circumvent that. So the judges in the federal courts have supported me more often than not until the last 10 or 12 years, and have given me legal bases for rulings. Now, in some of the cases that I had in criminal cases, the jurors were biased. And the way I dealt with the jurors, so you'll know, is I insisted upon there being some racial representation on the jurors, and that they were educated during voir dire on the tendency of people in America and in the jurisdiction where the trial was occurring to have racial attitudes that may not be obvious. Now, we have been able to get hung juries, and many times they were like 11-1 or 10-2. And we find that in those cases, the defendants in civil cases and the prosecution in criminal cases would rather not retry the cases because they don't know what the outcome is going to be. Now, my biggest success in civil juries and criminal juries in the civil court, in the federal courts, involved a couple of drug cases. We had a couple of clients who were accused of being drug kingpins, the Mexico to Texas to Arkansas connection. I recall one case prosecuted by the prosecutor's wife, Angela Jegley, and she had spent a lot of money and brought a lot of people in from Texas and other places. And we were able to get 3 black people on the jury, and we got a mistrial. We couldn't get a verdict, so it was a mistrial. Then we knew all the government's evidence at the second trial, and there were no surprise witnesses. So with that, we were able to prepare. And the second trial, with the same defendants, we had 2 defendants. We were there for 5 days. The jury got the case at 11:45. The judge ordered the bailiff to bring them food. They came back at 1, deliberated until 1:20, and returned a unanimous verdict for our clients. Now, it showed me that if you know enough about your cases and do enough preparation, and you have a just cause, racially tainted jurors may be capable of being persuaded to the justice of your case. And I have several other cases like that, but I think that I'd rather have now jury decisions in the federal system than I would court decisions.
But you have to have a unanimous verdict.
That's right. It was a unanimous verdict in this case I mentioned.
But they're rare.
Look, defeating the United States government is rare. But I have had good success. I've even sued the FBI and made them. This was the case involving a famous owner of a football team whose son had accused one of my clients of theft. You all know him. But we were able to make the government drop the case. And then we turned around and sued the son of this person for damages and got a small verdict, a small judgment, but a small, maybe it was a settlement. It was a settlement. So, but I think that many times the threat of a jury trial is frightening to defendants in civil cases because they too fear the possibility of an accidental verdict. And in that case, they don't know what will happen. So I've had a few accidental verdicts, and that helps your ability to practice law because it gives you, for future cases, a little settlement leverage.
Two or three last things I'm going to ask, and I'll stop. Based on your experience, and to what would you say to people that are watching this video and listening to you, what would you say to blacks in America based on your career?
I wouldn't say anything to blacks in America based on my career. I would say this. That there's still slavery in America. And the systems in place to deliver justice are more biased than not, and that the justice system cannot be used to deliver black people from slavery. Now, what will, I don't know. But I do know that we cannot depend on the courts. We must still depend upon our own initiative and our belief in justice and our continued pursuit of it, because we have no other option as the system now stands other than revolution. Now, I've been fortunate in part because I have had privileges and opportunities that few black people have had. And I have not had to consciously subordinate my principles to people of either race, including my friends like you and you. And while there is still distance between us, it's the kind of a distance that would be manageable if my personal characteristics allowed me to be more personable. So with lawyers, I think that collegiality is very important, and that I've had the privilege of trying to get more allies from across the room to help with our cause. And I've been somewhat successful. And some of them, it seems, have similar commitments to my justice concept and also my perspective. And you don't know those things unless you have that contact across racial lines. But you must also have it within racial lines. And I'd say to the persons who are trying to deliver justice who are African American that they must remember from whence we came, and that the task began years ago is still a task to be addressed without shame and with determination.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a wrap.
Done.